sure signs of I am procrastinating things that I should actually be doing right now is filming an extremely topical video. Hello everybody, I'm Roxy, this is Chaotic Beautiful, and today I am going to tell you about the books that I read in April. Now, have I filmed and uploaded the second part to the March wrap-up? No, I have not. But it is April 29th at the time of recording this. I am feeling like a person for the first time this week, and I just really want to talk about books because I miss being able to just sit down and read for hours. April was a really good reading month insofar that I read a lot of things that I really loved. Most of these are super short. All of these are super short, mainly because I didn't want to get sucked into a really long book. As it was already, sometimes I neglected doing some things just because I was so into the books that I was reading. A long book would have just wreaked havoc. I think this trend will continue at least until mid-June. Yeah. We'll see. Let's begin. So first, two books that I'm not going to say tons about because the reviews will be up hopefully next week. Both of them. Let's see. First one is There Are Little Kingdoms by Kevin Barrie. This is really the next video that I will upload because I really should do that. This was my pick for the low-key Overdue book club March, and it's a collection of short stories by Irish author Kevin Barrie, and I really enjoyed them. I had lots of thoughts, so please watch out for that video. Right after that one, I shall upload my review of Sayaka Murata's Earthlings. This was translated by Ginny, Tapley, Takemori, and it's a very interesting book about this young girl who thinks she's a witch and she's in love with her cousin who thinks he is an alien, and something happens when they are young and then they stop seeing and talking to each other, and then they reconnect when she is older. She's gotten married, but her marriage is very unconventional. The whole thing is bonkers. I don't know if I like this or not. It's been a month. I still don't know. I talked at length about it in that review. I think interesting is the word. I understand why people are put off by it. I have so much to discuss, so please watch out for that video. I'm really excited to share it with you. Then let's continue with graphic novels. I read 4 graphic novels this month. I am so excited with the development of this graphic novel agenda. You guys know that I became really interested in graphic novels a couple of years ago, and I've been purchasing a lot of them, and I think it's time that I read them all. So I'm really trying not to buy any more until I read all of the ones that I have. It's doable. That is my challenge for the rest of the year, I guess. I don't want to do this with all of the books that I own. Clearly, it's very unrealistic, but with graphic novels in particular, I would like to buy one to read in the moment and not accumulate them because I just love them so much. Let's begin with this one, which is actually the last one I read, Beverly by Nick Dnarso. I feel like I should know this because he was making the rounds on BookTube because he is the author of Sabrina, which was nominated to the Booker Prize, the first graphic novel ever to be nominated to the Booker Prize. I haven't read that one yet, but I do own it because we're going to review it with Danny for Pluma Pantalla. This one is a collection of interconnected short stories. It has the same style, the same muted palette, the same somewhat geometric. I really enjoyed them. It took some time for me to realize they were interconnected, but the way they are interconnected is really interesting. It's a bit like Olive Kitteridge in the sense that there are stories that are about the same family, but there are other stories that are only tangentially related, and the way that they interweave is amazing. Especially the last story only works to its full effect if you've read the stories in order. The thing about these stories in general, they are very meh in terms of narrative arc. They are all about the underlying sadness, disappointment, even danger that comes from interacting with other people. It reminded me a bit of Adrian Tomin's Killing and Dying and short stories in general, in the sense of they are so depressing in many ways. The things that happen are quite chilling because they are very real and the way they are told is very oblique and very domestic, and it focuses on how people gossip about this thing that happened, for example. There are all these moments of silence, of waiting and tension. It's interesting because the faces are not super expressive, but with the dialogue and this disaffected framing of the scenes, it creates this effect of, ugh. At least that was the effect that I felt. Even the cover is a bit disquieting. I think if you like that sort of short story, if you like Adrian, for example, I think you might like this. The art style I don't like as much as a personal preference, but it's still super smart, super interesting, very quiet, but very effective. Really enjoyed it. Can't wait to read Sabrina. The other fiction graphic novel I want to tell you about is Asterios Polyp by David Mazzucchelli, and this I got from the library. This graphic novel seems to be designed for me in many ways. So it's about this professor whose house burns down right at the beginning of the story. And so he's forced to relocate, and he chooses to go to this sort of Midwestern town and starts working as a mechanic. Interspersed with that present storyline is the story of how he became a professor, but his first marriage, his family life. And it sounds very quotidian and mundane, and it's because it is, but the way it is told through the art is amazing. The way the art mirrors the different personalities and how specifically two people who view the world through different lenses are drawn differently, and then they start interacting and they start building a reality together, and how that is illustrated in the graphic novel is amazing. I should have said at the beginning that Asterios is a paper architect, which means he's a really renowned architect, but nothing he has ever designed has been built. But he has won prizes for his architecture and he teaches it. He has this tendency of examining life in binary oppositions. It's fascinating how the novel pushes back against it. I must say, of course, that if you love super likable characters, this is probably not the novel for you. It does fall into this super smart professor trope. He does get a sort of redemption arc, and I feel like a lot of people might just not be interested in this story because of the main character, which is totally legit, but I loved it. And the ending, oh my god. There is one more element that concerns who the narrator is, but I do consider that a spoiler, so I won't mention it. But the narrative voice is also very interesting. So yeah, that is Asterios Polyp. We'll definitely revisit. Another graphic novel that I got from the library is Neurocomic by, let me check, Hana and Matteo Farinella. I think Matteo Farinella is the illustrator and Hana the writer. This is a fictional, yes, because of what happens, a graphic novel, but it's supposed to teach you about the brain. It's about this guy who gets into the brain of someone. That sounds so weird. It's basically this guy who sees a beautiful woman and he wants to talk to her, and suddenly he's being sucked into this place. Very Alice in Wonderland sort of situation. It turns out it's a brain. And so he travels. In the process, they explain to you concepts like neurotransmitters, how the proteins are released, and even gets at the idea of consciousness and mind and the idea of the self. And at the end, it actually gets super meta, and it's like, this is a book that people can read because sequential ordering in the brain. And it's really interesting. It's really fun. My problem is that if you know a lot about the brain, you know a lot of these things, which what made it actually more fun. But I question how effective this is for someone who doesn't know a lot about the brain, which is actually the intended audience. Because if you do know a lot about the brain, you know all of this. And it's more like, oh, this is a whimsical way of explaining it. It just feels overtly complicated in a way, like the level of abstraction and of metaphor, because it plays with, oh, we are like parachuters and we're going to this, and it feels like at times, instead of clarifying it, is more complicated than just saying, hey, the enzymes are released and attached to the other, like the neuroreceptors, blah blah blah. This is a common problem, I think, with illustrating biological things. I remember when I took fundamentals of neuroscience, there were videos that illustrated similar process and were animations, and some people were like, yes, this is super helpful, and then some other people were like, actually this metaphor makes it even harder because now I have to like keep tabs on the metaphor. I tended to be on the camp of these metaphors are a bit too complicated for me. But other than that, I thought it was a really interesting comic. The art style is very simple, old school cartoon sort of situation, and I really enjoyed that. And I liked it. I mostly enjoyed that they talked about the founding fathers of neuroscience, how they were like part of this whole adventure. Again, it was very Alice in Wonderland-esque, but it does feel a bit too much to be effective teaching tool, if that makes sense. The final graphic novel that I want to tell you about, I keep thinking of it as a memoir, but it's actually just very, very, very autofictional. Notes on a Thesis by Tiphaine Rivière, and this is translated from the French by Francesca Barrie. This is based on the blog of the same name that the artist started while she was writing her PhD, and this is a fictionalization of that time. Jean is a former school teacher and she starts working with the leading expert on Kafka, and she's so hopeful and so naive, and then everything goes wrong. On the back, it says, if you've ever stared gloomily at a blank page, battled with office administrators, or driven yourself and everyone you know mad by droning on about your work, then Notes on a Thesis will make you laugh or cry in recognition. What I would say about this book in general is that it is supposed to be funny, and in many ways it is, but it's so dark and so real that I would never give this to any of my friends that are doing PhDs. Because like they would crumble. They are barely holding it on as it is. I don't think this would help at all. I just feel like it's so despairing that you would have to be extremely thick-skinned to find this funny. And I did enjoy it because like the art is really cool, and she's also not the most sympathetic character, which helps finding like the humor in these things. And some of the situations she goes through are like ridiculous because academia is ridiculous, because life is ridiculous, I guess. So in that way it is really funny, but in others it's just so sad. It does have some pacing issues. It feels like it's 3 arcs, the beginning, the middle, and those two have, let's say, 40 and 40%, and then the rest is 20%, and it's rushed, and suddenly she's ready to defend her thesis, and suddenly everything has magically come together. But in spite of that, I think it's really well done. It does what it sets out to do. The art is really interesting and really cool. I really like it, actually. It's very modern, sort of, I don't even know how to describe it. It's like cartoonish, but would I recommend this? If you enjoy campus novels and don't mind reading about the despairing state of academia, then this is for you. But if you think it will hit a tiny bit too close to home, then I would say maybe not. Okay, let's move on with 2 other books that I checked out from the library. First is Richard Long, A Line Made by Walking by Dieter Roelstraete. I'm so sorry. This is a study, let's say, about Richard Long's work called A Line Made by Walking, which is, I'll put a picture here, but it's basically a non-object or barely there art or conceptual art, although that label is very contested and the book goes into that. Basically, what he did was walk one line to and fro many times until you could see a line in the field. One of the points discussed in the book actually is what precisely is the art? Is it the walking? Is it the space? Is it the line that is left afterwards, etc.? Many, many points. I read this because I wrote on A Line Made by Walking by Sarah Baum, which I will talk about in the second part of my March wrap-up whenever that comes up. And in that book, this work is referenced. I actually had a lot of fun because it talks a lot about conceptual art. It doesn't only talk about Richard Long's work, who I didn't know before starting this. I guess I knew him because it is mentioned in Sarah Baum's book, but I never sort of thought about it further. I really enjoyed this book. I thought it was really interesting. It made a lot of very, very interesting points regarding conceptual art. It explains a lot of the history of conceptual art in Britain in particular, and that I didn't know anything about, so I found it very, very interesting. It was written in a very accessible tone. I wouldn't even know this book existed if it weren't for this very particular thing. So it's very niche. However, I thought it was super interesting. It broadens beyond just Richard Long's work, but it also goes into its importance, which again, I knew nothing about, so I thought this was great. And the last book that I borrowed from the library and I finished in April was Michelle Zauner's Crying in H Mart. And I started this book, I think, in March, but then sort of put it down because I was reading a lot of other things. And then I was suddenly craving like a really, really good memoir, and I picked this up. So this is the story of the author relationship to her mother, who has passed away. And actually the first line is something like, "Ever since my mother died, I cry in H Mart." It delves into many different things. First of all, Michelle Zauner, she's the lead singer, or she is rather, I think, Japanese Breakfast, which I did know, but I don't really listen to their music. Yeah, never mind. Michelle Zauner is half Korean. Her mom was Korean, her dad wasn't. The memoir also explores what it is like to grow up being part of this culture, but also being from a different culture from your mother, and those intersections and frictions. It is so much about food because her mom used to cook things a certain way. It talks about what it is like growing up in a small town, race, and becoming a singer, but it's all filtered or centered around her mother's death and the whole process, because she died of cancer. And so it was a process in many ways. I don't know why I spent so long talking about it. You probably heard about it already, but in any case, it is heartbreaking and as good as everyone says. It is super well written. It is one of those memoirs that completely deserves the hype. The way it describes the food makes you super hungry. The way it describes their relationship, so affecting. Also, I think the way Michelle Zauner is willing to be vulnerable, the way she is willing to go to these places where she feels ashamed or she reveals her own pettiness and she's aware of it and she brings it up, the way she's able to be so generous to everyone around her while also acknowledging the negative feelings she had for them, is just beautiful and heartbreaking, and I am so glad I read it. I think this is one that I would definitely reread. It's a really great book, really recommend it. And if you like food memoirs, memoirs in general, memoirs about family, if you like to read about motherhood, you cannot miss this book. Okay, another quick one, hopefully, because I've said I'm going to be quick so many times and I haven't been. This is not translated into English, sadly. Mi Amiga Gladys by Pedro Lemebel. You know that I love Pedro Lemebel. He was a Chilean author and he was an amazing writer and also queer icon. And the only book that is translated by him, sadly, is his only novel, My Tender Matador. But his main writings were actually columns. And these in particular, the ones he dedicated to Gladys Marin, who you might not have heard about. But I will link her Wikipedia in English. I assume there is one. I haven't looked, but there should be. But she was a really important politician and activist, militant, communist, and amazing woman. She ran for president and sadly never won. She was amazing, so inspiring. They were very, very good friends, and he wrote about her several times. And these columns range from the more political, so Lemebel talks about them going on her presidential campaign tour, to the more media-centered. So two super great columns that are here is one where Pedro Lemebel went to this very famous talk show. It was a whole thing that happened. I actually don't know if I saw it live or if I've seen it later, but I do remember my family watching the talk show itself. And he talks about how celebrity culture was so complicit during the dictatorship, or rather how the dictatorship originated what we now consider the Chilean celebrity culture in order to cover up. There's another great column about Lemebel interviewing Roberto Bolaño. Yes, that Roberto Bolaño. And Roberto Bolaño being super upset because she, Gladys Marin, showed up to the panel as a guest, but there was this commotion when she entered the auditorium, and so Bolaño was super rude about it. Bolaño and Lemebel stopped being friends over this episode. Reading that, I was so shocked. I had no idea they had been friends. I don't know a lot about Roberto Bolaño, but apparently it was the first time he visited Chile after his self-imposed exile in Mexico, so it was a whole thing. And then there are some columns that are much more intimate. I know I said I was going to keep it short. I'm sorry. I really love this book. It also comes with pictures, like, look. That is Gladys Marin. That is Lemebel. Look, what an icon. What an icon. I'm so happy that I can show you these pictures. Look at this. It's so sweet. Here is Gladys Marin giving a speech. There is Salvador Allende. There they are, like, marching, because both were often kept out of these leftist spaces that they felt so strongly about. It's just their friendship, tenderness, companionship, comradeship. It's just so beautiful and so present in these pages. It's just like a warm hug to the heart. If you speak Spanish and want to know more, Danny and I did record an episode on Mi Amiga Gladys. I don't know when that will be up, but it will be up soon. So the link to the podcast is always down below. Okay, this was not short at all. I'm sorry. Let's move on. I didn't know I had actually read so many books in April. And I know it's not so many books, but I had forgotten the books that I already returned to the library. And it turns out this was not as short as I thought it was going to be. And it also doesn't help that I've been rambling a lot. I am going to tell you about The Anthropocene Unconscious: Climate Catastrophe Culture by Mark Bolt. This is a book that I read because we interviewed Mark Bolt for the Movable Type podcast, and I talked about that in the Springathon possibility pile, which I'll link down below. This episode should be up already, so if that's the case, I am going to leave the specific link to that down below. But if not, remember to check the Movable Type podcast. The interview was super fun. Mark Bolt is so smart, so interesting, and just a great writer. Basically, he teaches film and science fiction. If you read any of the companions to science fiction, like Routledge, Cambridge, Oxford, all of them, he is cited and has written for them. But in this book, he takes this argument by Amitav Ghosh that modern fiction, modern literary fiction, has sort of failed to represent the climate crisis and the climate reality, unless we are talking specifically about climate fiction. Mark Bolt says, no, that is not the case. Taking a lot from queer film criticism, reading Against the Grain. He talks a lot about readjusting your framework or rewriting the master code of something to reveal how these things in their silences actually reveal things about, in this case, climate change. So that's what he does. In here, he goes from analyzing Sharknado to Jane Austen to Paul Auster. It is an amazing book. It is very, very interesting. It is intended for the general public, and we talked about that, like what are the differences of writing for the general public. The tone in here strikes that perfect balance between there is actually quite a lot of close reading and quite a lot of theory in here, but also it is most certainly not academic in the sense that it even uses swearing, it uses a lot of slang, it is very approachable, it takes all these digressions. It's just such a fun book to read if you're into theory and philosophy. It is basically that done right. Really recommend this if you are into climate studies, if you're into literary studies, if you're into both. I really, really recommend it. It's just such a fun book, and also it rekindled my love of theory, which in spite of everything that has happened masters wise is still strong. I feel like that is one thing that has been reasserted, is that I do love sort of philosophy and literary theory. I had kind of forgotten because I focused on linguistics for my undergrad. Yeah, it was just nice to go back and read these things and find it like, it can be fun, it can be enjoyable. Really, really recommend it. On that note, I also read Rhythm Analysis, Space, Time, and Everyday Life by Henry Lefebvre. Oh my god, I am going to have to learn to pronounce this last name at some point soon. But for now, let's just focus on the book. This was translated by Stuart Eldon and Gerald Moore. This is a short but really, really impactful book. So I first found out about this writer because I took a Marxism and Modernism optional course. And I was looking into details and into everyday life, and Lefebvre wrote a book called The Critique of Everyday Life, which is a really chunky boy that I have read a lot of, but I haven't read cover to cover, hence it won't pop up on any of my wrap-ups anytime soon probably. But this I read while procrastinating for that reading. Turns out that this was so fun, I actually ended up using it for an essay that I should be writing instead of filming this video. He wrote almost 70 books, so imagine that. He wrote a lot on cities and appropriating space and the relationship with daily practices and everyday space. And in here, he sort of culminates in a way. This was his last book and was published posthumously. So rhythms, and he talks about rhythms of the cities, rhythms also of the body, and he outlines a framework of how focusing on rhythms can generate knowledge and presence, and a framework through which to approach daily life and the relationship of capital and modes of production in relation to daily life. And again, this focuses on the method of rhythm analysis and how that can be done, basically. What I will say is that I think it would get on a lot of people's nerves because it is very literary and abstract. At times he goes very rigorous and he outlines all these principles, but then he goes very abstract and asks rhetorical questions. Can we ever know like all about rhythms? Probably not. It's a mixture of outlining methodology, but then also going into all these tangents and these very abstract ideas of what rhythms are and how they might be, how the rhythm analyst has to be in the moment, but also abstract themselves from the moment in order to be able to analyze it. Sometimes it feels like it goes a little bit in circles, but in a delightful way. I really enjoy the prose. Again, if you are into urban studies and enjoy philosophy in general, I think you will like this. And finally, I have At Night All Blood is Black by David Diop. This was translated by Anna Moskovakis. I am killing the pronunciation game today. I deeply apologize. This was the winner of the Booker International, I want to say last year? 2021. I read this mostly solely based on Seb's from Apocalypse Readings recommendation, so I will link his channel down below so you can check it out. He said it was really great. The reason I wasn't very interested in reading this is because it's about war. And if you know me, I just don't want to read about war. However, if you know me, you also know that I can read about virtually anything as long as it's well written. And oh my god, was this well written. So this is about Alpha, who has seen his best friend die in his arms. His best friend Mademba asked him to kill him, to finish him off basically, and Alpha was unable to do so, and it haunts him. I don't want to give any more details because I feel like everything else would be a spoiler, but the narration, what it does is that it is like an oral retelling and you really, really feel Alpha is telling you this. It repeats these phrases over and over. I think this might be the first time I ever say this. I would like to listen to an audiobook of this book if the narrator was a good one. So if you've listened to the audiobook of this, please let me know. I might try and get it somehow. It even opens with an ellipsis, which means this has been going on. So how I've described it, I think, is a spiral that goes towards a resolution because it kind of circles, it sort of piles on and develops into the end. There are many ways you can read the ending, but if you take it as a literal face value, I think it is the most interesting. It is so good. What I will say though is that I am not 100% sure about the female characters. There is a lot of imagery regarding, you know, the war as female and the trenches as, I don't remember if like womb or labia, but it kind of has that connotation. And then there are two female characters whose sole contribution is that they have sex with the characters. It is done with a purpose, and I don't think it's particularly demeaning in any way, but if you apply that lens, it is kind of unescapable that they are just accessory to this very homosocial sort of thing. So that is my only asterisk. I don't think the book is all the worse for it. I just think I can't not bring it up. However, I still think it's a really, really smart book. It is so visceral, how it describes the horrors of war, but also how it describes the horrors of war in contrast to the potential heroism involved in war. It really pushes back against that narrative. It also talks a lot about race because it is about Senegalese soldiers fighting, in the Great War. So of course, race is a central element, especially because the soldier who kills Mademba is referred to as a blue-eyed monster or devil. So yeah, those tensions are very much a fundamental part of the book. Other than the themes, other than what actually happens, for me, it's 100% in the writing. I would not have liked this book if it hadn't been written so well, so hauntingly beautiful. It is grotesque at times, but always with a purpose, never gratuitously. But it's also very earnest in its affection. Like Alpha really cares for Mademba. The vulnerability, the rawness. It's a very raw book. I wasn't expecting to be so gripped by it, but actually I read it only in a couple sittings. Interestingly enough, for some reason, it occurred to me that I wanted to tell you what I was reading. I guess because in my mind, this was going to be a short video because I didn't have too much to tell you about. And then I rambled for like an hour. Hopefully I can cut this to like 30 minutes. But I already have the books that I'm currently reading, so I'm just going to tell you. So the first one is a bit of a shaming. It's that I still haven't finished David Copperfield. I really should have by now. I have been reading a couple of pages every day, which is not enough to catch up in a promptly manner, but I am enjoying it. I am also dipping in and out of The Letters of Vida Sackville West to Virginia Woolf, edited by Luis De Salvo and Mitchell A. Laska. What a delight. What a delight. I ship these two, but also I just love Vida so much. I think she is so flirty and so fun and so full of life. Just really love her. I am making my way through Carol Ann Duffy's Sincerity, of course loving her poetry, although it might not be my favorite collection by her, by the way. I am also reading Yukio Mishima, The Frolic of the Beasts. Very excited to tell you about this one. And finally, I am reading this collection of short stories called The Sun on My Head by Giovanni Martins. It says the best-selling literary sensation from Brazil. This is translated by Julia Sanchez. Oh, nice, cool. Or Julia. Does she go by Julia? Whenever I wrap this up, we'll come with a story about my relationship with Brazil, and the stories are quite good so far, so I'm really excited to read more. And that's it. I hope that is how I had reviewed everything. But instead, you have this very chaotic, it is on brand, I will say, video of me rambling. Please let me know if you've read any of these books, what you thought about them. Do you want to read any of these books? Have you read anything particularly interesting in April or something you've hated? Please let me know. That's all. See you next time. What are all those children? See, this is the problem with spring. Like, spring begins and all the children start going out. That makes me sound like such a hateful human being, which, okay, maybe fair. I like how these kind of like have a similar scheme, like color scheme. Isn't that cool? I like this. I'm gonna use. So, Rachel's.